social science research. So Stein Rokkan was as much a sociologist as a political scientist. He had a very broad scope in his intellectual endeavors, and it was to encourage also comparative research that this prize was established in 1981. The prize originally was given every third year, and the amount that was given was $3,000. We entered into a discussion with the University of Bergen, which offered to make it into an annual prize of 5,000 euros, which is very generous, and therefore now, as of now, it will be awarded on an annual basis. And today we are going to award the prizes for 2008 and 2009, and I will give the floor to the rector of the University of Bergen. This was the home base of Stein Rokkan, and I think it's only appropriate that we are introduced to both the prize and Stein Rokkan by the rector. So please, Sigmund Grønvold.
Thank you very much, colleagues and friends. It is a great pleasure for the University of Bergen to contribute to the Stein Rokkan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. And we are very pleased that the prize from now on will be awarded annually. For me, as rector of the University of Bergen, it is a great pleasure and an honor to take part in this award ceremony. The prize is, as it is said, awarded in honor and memory of Stein Rokkan, who pioneered comparative social science research. Rokkan was a Norwegian political scientist and social scientist. He was educated in philosophy and became a professor of comparative politics at the University of Bergen. He was a Renaissance figure of gigantic productivity, manifoldness, and creativity, who contributed immensely to the development of modern political science, political sociology, and social science in general. In his unique scholarly work, Rokkan contributed to the study of the formation of nation-states in Europe and their democratization. Our understanding of the nation-state and democracy owes a great deal to the ambitious research program of this outstanding scientist. Above all, Stein Rokkan's fascinating historical macro-sociological fresco of Europe reveals the magnificence and the uniqueness of the birth of mass democracy, unquestionably the most formidable change experiment in the political history of humanity, when, for the first time in an unprecedented but successful experiment, equal and free citizens were involved and participated in political decision-making. Stein Rokkan was not only an excellent scholar, he also devoted inexhaustible energy to the creation of a worldwide social science community. He was a founder and president of core organizations such as the International Social Science Council and the European Consortium of Political Research. He was a secretary of the International Sociological Association and the president of the International Political Science Association. Social scientists from all over the world have been profoundly inspired by Stein Rokkan's work, and they have experienced the great value of his efforts to build comparative, historical, and machine-readable databases. These databases provide excellent opportunities for comparative, historical, and empirical research. For example, Rokkan was the founder and the first director of the Norwegian Social Science Data Services, one of the leading institutions of its kind in the world, located here at the University of Bergen. In general, Stein Rokkan combined his international activities in different organizations and in different parts of the world with his tremendous efforts as the most important social science entrepreneur and institution builder in Bergen. In the mid-1960s, he was one of the founders of social science studies at the University of Bergen, which was still a young university. In 1966, he became the university's first professor of sociology with a special responsibility to develop comparative politics. It is fair to say that his intellectual work on state and nation building democratization, elections, cleavages and party systems, and European political development, has proved of enduring significance. This will be demonstrated in the session on the legacy of Stein Rokkan at this World Social Science Forum here in Bergen. It is also fair to say, and proper to say, that all the organizations that he helped to found, organize, develop, and chair internationally as well as nationally and locally are still well and very much alive 30 years after his death. What is especially astonishing about Stein Rokkan is that by looking at the past, he continuously points to the future. He will for long remain a deeply relevant thinker, and his message, rather than being yesterday's half-remembered lesson, provides an indispensable guide to progress in our future intellectual efforts. I would also like to emphasize that Stein Rokkan was an extremely gifted and generous teacher. He would inspire and challenge his students and guide them to start simple research from the first hour in any course. He would engage them in collaborative efforts to provide each other with new data and new opportunities for research. He would also quickly guide his students both to the classical contributions as well as to the most relevant recent unpublished studies. And he would early on take students along to international meetings and conferences, as well as copy them in on letters he exchanged with leading scholarly colleagues. Thus, he gave his students the experience of being part of a broad international collaborative enterprise, meaning that individual efforts would lead to collective goods, and that all actors involved in the research could contribute to enhancing the quality of each other's work. It is hard to envisage a more adequate setting than Bergen for today's award ceremony. It was here in Bergen Stein Rokkan had his main base, a worthy setting for the awarding of Stein Rokkan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. For the University of Bergen, it is a great pleasure to be engaged in the funding and awarding of this prize. For us, this engagement has a double purpose: to honor the legacy of Stein Rokkan and to inspire the type of research that he pioneered.
So now you've heard the justification and also the legacy that we're celebrating. But in order to find someone to award the prize to, we need two things. We need a search and we need a choice. And in order to carry that out, we have a special jury. And the jury is chaired by Klaus Alminjon, and the three other members is Professor Manfred Schmidt from the University of Heidelberg, Professor Maurizio Ferreira from the University of Milano, and Professor Stein Kunle here from the University of Bergen. I will now give the floor to the chair of the jury. So Klaus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Before I start saying nice things about those the winners who are there, I would like to say some nice things about those who are not there, who submitted their books but didn't make for the prize. And I have to say, and that was the opinion of the jury, we were overwhelmed by the quality of the books submitted. And had we had more prizes to give than just the two for 2008 and 2009, we easily could award them with the very best reasons. We were very happy to see that social science is doing fine, and as a European, I have to say, I'm very happy to see that, that social science is doing fine, not only in the US, but in many regions of the world. So that was, for us, a great experience to read these books. And we learned quite a lot, not only from the two we decided to award the prize. Having said this, I have to say that it was not so difficult for us to make the choice in favor of Kasmudis and Robert Goodin's and others' book. Both books are, in a certain sense, Rokkanian. I will come back to that very soon. And in addition, I've been told that Rokkan liked thick books. And in that sense, these books are Rokkanian as well. But apart from that, Kasmudis' book is a great book on right parties, populist parties, and it is I and my colleagues, we learned quite a lot from that. And I can illustrate that with a simple thing. I have, for my lectures in comparative politics for 2-3 years now, slides on these right-wing populist parties. And I used them based on the literature. And having read Kasmudis' book, I just decided to send these slides to the trash bin, because he simply revises the literature, he looks at the empirical evidence and shows that many things we thought they are right, they are wrong. In the case of the book by Goodin and others, that was an eye-opener for the jury, because it has such a simple argument. And the simple argument is you can be poor in terms of money, but you can also be poor in terms of time. And being poor in terms of time may be as bad as being poor in terms of money. And then the question is, how can we explain that some individuals in some countries are much better off in terms of poverty in time than, or worse off in poverty in time than others? And Goodin and his co-authors provide a convincing answer to this. Let me come now to the laudatio for the two books. The first book is Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, authored by Kasmudis from the University of Antwerp. It's a path-breaking work. It is the most systematic comparative study on this family of parties and covers Western Europe as well as Central and Eastern Europe. Made defines populist radical right parties by nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. The book is based on extensive empirical research by the author, who interviews a profound knowledge of the parties being studied with analytical and typological perspectives. It's this rich combination of data and theory we know from Rokkan. The book sets a very high standard for all subsequent work in parties of the right. It's not only a major contribution to thick description and empirical and theoretical explanation of these parties, it will also serve as a prominent reading requirement in any course on parties in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. Made analyzes both the demand side and the supply side of populist radical parties, explores their organizational features, and studies in detail their voters and members. In addition, he investigates the policy dimension. His conclusion draws on impressively broad database and masterful knowledge of the literature in various languages. The book deconstructs a large number of myths. It's not the economy stupid, chapter 5 argues. It is mistaken to see neoliberalism as a constituent element of right-wing populism. And these parties are not so pronounced Männerparteien, parties of men, as many claim. Made emphasizes that these parties are not only a product of their socio-economic and political environment, rather they are active in developing programs and ideologies, and they are active in shaping and molding their position in the political systems and societies in Europe. Made echoes the Rokkanian approach by being highly sensitive to peculiarities of the countries under study and to history, and to their history. He knows the cases. At the same time, he is courageous and ambitious in forging generalizations and theoretical advances. Made's work is not only an outstanding contribution to comparative social research, but also a marvelous example of the Rokkanian approach. Let me come to the second book, the prize, Stein Rokkan Prize for 2009. This book is Discretionary Time, a New Measure of Freedom, and it's authored by Robert Goodin, James Mahmoud Rice, Antti Palpo and Line Eriksen. Discretionary Time is a book that combines originality in conceptual and theoretical terms with comparative analysis of temporal autonomy in 6 democracies. Discretionary time is the time the use of which is not dictated by the necessities of life. Necessities of life are the needs to access enough income to meet the minimum requirements embodied in the poverty line, to do household labor, including minding the children, and personal care, such as eating, sleeping, bathing. The international team and team composed of men and women that wrote this path-breaking analysis argues that there is not only the risk of poverty in terms of money, but also, and in Western democracies probably more important, the risk of poverty in time. Building on innovative work on time use and extending it in a systematic fashion, the authors elegantly argue that time matters. They measure and study discretionary time in 6 democracies based on the combination of various data sets on time use and income. Discretionary times varies considerably between nations. Goodin et al. Find that life cycle decisions are the most important determinants of the amount of discretionary time. However, the welfare state is also a major reason, a major explanatory variable. On average, citizens enjoy 5 hours a week more discretionary time in social democratic and female-friendly welfare regimes than in liberal or conservative regimes. Slightly parodying their results, the authors summarize, to maximize temporal autonomy in discretionary time, people should marry but never have children. If they do have children, never divorce, and may be considering moving to Sweden. This is the optimal combination. You learned quite a lot for your life right now. Building on Marx' insight, Ökonomie der Zeit, darin löst sich schließlich alle Ökonomie auf. Discretionary time shifts the emphasis of welfare state analysis from money to time in a highly original way. The book is not only a pleasure to read and a masterpiece in comparative secondary data analysis, it is an eye-opener which offers novel perspectives on welfare, gender, and household regimes, and on the interaction between these regimes and individual freedom, which requires discretionary time. The prerequisite of freedom has been hitherto all too frequently neglected in political science and politics. Discretionary time emphasizes the prominence it deserves.
Thank you very much for this excellent work of the jury. And before you move to Sweden, where you probably should not vote for a right-wing party in order to live up to the results of these 2 studies taken together, there are 2 things that are going to happen now. First, we will ask the 2 recipients of the awards to come up to the stage to receive a diploma and a check. And then we will have the opportunity to listen to their own story from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But first, we will invite them up on the rostrum to receive the diploma and the check. So, Cas Mudde, coming first, is the recipient of the 2008 award. And here is the diploma. Unless you want to take the check first.
No, I'll take the diploma.
So the check, the diploma, and here comes the check. And then to you, on behalf of all your co-authors also, the diploma, and there will be a check also for all the co-authors that you can also share with them. Congratulations. All right, I will then ask the recipients to take a seat up here. And what we will now have, as I said, was a brief presentation. We have given each of the authors 15 minutes to present the results of their studies and their studies. So please, we will then first start with the Stein Rokkan Prize for 2008, Cas Mudde. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it truly is an honor and a joy, a big joy, to receive the 2008 Stein Rokkan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. I cannot deny it. I have dreamed of this moment. I just never believed it would come true. In fact, I have nagged many people around me about never winning a prize, but it seemed that I hold out for the big one. The honor comes most notably from standing on the shoulder of giants. First and foremost, of course, those of Stein Rokkan, whose erudite and systematic comparative research has always been an inspiration to me. Every year I have to, unfortunately, teach comparative European politics. I always do the cleavage theory, which always confuses my students, but then whatever paper they later write, they will refer back to the cleavage theory. But I also stand on the shoulders of previous winners of the Stein Rokkan Prize, most notably including my former PhD supervisor, Peter Mayer, to whom I owe an incredible intellectual debt. I also want to thank the committee members, as well as the ISSC, for hosting this great ceremony. Now, as my fiancée told me when she heard I was allowed to speak for roughly 15 minutes at the ceremony, at the Oscars they get only 2 minutes. So therefore refrain now from further thanks and well wishes and move on to a short presentation of my book, Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, which brought me to the beautiful, if rainy, city of Bergen. I aim to make a threefold contribution to the literature on the radical right parties in Europe. First, to present an overview of the key writings, most notably going beyond the English language literature, which dominates much of it, but actually include also German, Dutch, French literature. And particularly the Germans are for very obvious reasons, very busy with the topic of the radical right. Yet their literature is kind of insular, but also doesn't make it much outside of the German-speaking area, so that was one of the things I did. I also wanted to offer significant revisions of some commonly held misperceptions, and then suggest some innovations on three aspects: concepts, issues, and explanations. To do this, I employed a party-centric approach and a pan-European focus, studying populist radical right parties in both Eastern and Western Europe. To be honest, I could not have written this book without the generous help of a broad group of colleagues and former students. Because despite the fact that there is a phenomenal literature on radical right parties, which is totally disproportional to their relevance actually, most countries and parties remain heavily understudied, and little is available in the major languages, and often not even in the native languages. Now, rather than walk you through the whole book, let me pick a couple of the revisions and devote a bit more attention to what I believe to be the major theoretical innovation presented in the book. First, I have to say something quickly about terminology. I won't bore you, but you might wonder what a populist radical right party is. A populist radical right party combines three ideological core features: nativism, which simply stated is a combination of nationalism and xenophobia; authoritarianism, which is the belief in the need for a strictly ordered society with severe punishment of any infringement upon that order. And this doesn't necessarily mean anti-democracy. And then populism, the belief that society is divided between two antagonistic and homogeneous groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and that politics should follow common sense, which is the alleged will of the people. Now, the two revisions that I will speak about were already mentioned by Professor Arminjon. I will elaborate them a bit. The first one is, as a consequence of the work of two of the most influential authors in the field, Hans-Georg Betz and Herbert Kitschelt, much of the literature on populist radical right parties, as well as broader literature on political parties and European politics, contends that, on the one hand, populist radical right parties are neoliberal, in essence in favor of a free market, and second, that this is a key reason for their electoral success. Now, based on an analysis of party literature and electoral surveys, my book shows both views to be untrue. Populist radical right parties support a mixed economy, in many ways not much different from Christian Democrats and third-way social democrats. The reason they stand out from other party families, including these two as well as neoliberals, is that their economic program is secondary to their core ideology of nativism, authoritarianism, and populism. In essence, populist radical right parties support a nativist economy in which globalization is considered a big threat to the nation, and the state is called upon to protect the national economy from foreign influences. It also means a support for welfare chauvinism. They do support the welfare state, but they want to limit it only to the own people. As far as neoliberal policies were ever supported, they tended to be supported out of opportunistic or populist reasons. Most notably, in various countries where parties and the economy had close relations, one can think of countries like Austria or Italy or Belgium, they would favor privatizations, not so much because they believed in the free market, because that way they would undermine the power of the mainstream parties, which would channel a lot of economic resources through this system into their own party. So in a sense, what they tried to do was create a level playing field. This brings me to the second revision, and that is about the role of women. Now, the received wisdom in the mostly feminist literature on the topic holds that, first, women are greatly underrepresented in populist radical right parties, and second, that this is because of the nativist and sexist ideology of the parties. With regard to the former, it is true that women are greatly underrepresented in populist radical right parties. But this is the case in virtually all political parties. Few, if any, party, let alone party family, has gender equality in its leadership, membership, and electorate. And if one compares populist radical right parties to other party families, most notably those of the right, they do not fare that badly in female representation. In terms of female party leaders, the populist radical right outperforms many other party families. And in many cases, the female leaders are not token women. They are actually the party. Think about Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party in Australia, or of course Pia Kjærsgaard, Danish People's Party. Also, if compared to other right-wing parties, rather than just left-wing parties or green parties that much of the literature does, the underrepresentation of women within their legislative factions and membership do not stand out. The only reason why various factions are so underrepresented is because they're extremely small. Radical right parties often have one-person factions. And as soon as one-person factions are there, they are almost always, irrespective of the ideology of a party, one-man factions. The only thing that really stands out is voters. The populist radical right electorate is, with only few exceptions, two-thirds male. Most explanations of this phenomenon have a feminist bias, assuming that women are feminist and non-nativist. Surveys either nuance this with regard to feminism or reject this with regard to nativism. Overall, women are as supportive of key populist radical right positions as men. Moreover, most of these parties hold so-called modern traditional gender views, which are much similar to Christian democratic parties or conservative parties, party families with traditionally high female electoral support. I argue that women are socialized differently, which leads, among other things, to a lower level of political efficacy, which has been demonstrated in many electoral studies. This lower political efficacy leads women to vote more traditionally, in essence for established center parties, and to shy away from parties that are either new or are generally perceived as extreme. Populist radical right parties in general tend to be both. This explanation can also explain some of the exceptions. In essence, political radical right parties that have not suffered from low female support, despite particularly traditional gender positions and strong nativism. The most extreme example of this is the League of Polish Families, an Orthodox Catholic party with strong anti-Semitism and nativism. However, its electorate was 2/3 female, something you only find normally among Green parties. The explanation is that the party was endorsed, at least for a short period, by Radio Maria, which is an Orthodox Catholic nativist radio station which has a whole subculture around it. And within that subculture, the League of Polish Families is considered to be mainstream and acceptable. And it's also there, within that subculture, that much of the electorate, which is largely elderly women, can be found. This brings me to the main innovation suggested in this book, at least in my opinion. Unfortunately, I came to that pretty late. And as everyone knows who has written a book, at a certain point in time, you just want to get rid of it. So the idea is there, and I've since been trying to develop it, or others could say, substantiate it. Though often implicitly, the populist radical right is almost exclusively perceived in the terms of the German sociologist Eugen Klingemann as a normal pathology. In that view, political radical right values are remnants of a pre-modern past held by only a tiny minority of the population of Western democracies. Hence, only in abnormal circumstances, generally referred to as crisis, will the radical right be able to attract mass support. In this view, the puzzle is to account for the demand side of populist radical right politics. Why would anyone have a demand for this pre-modern type of politics? I argue that, in fact, populist radical right values are very much in line with mainstream values in contemporary European democracies. For example, nativism is a radical interpretation of the broadly shared illusion of the desirable nation-state. Similarly, populism builds upon the democratic promise. To stick with Eugen Klingemann's psychological vocabulary, the populist radical right is rather a pathological normalcy, a radicalization of the mainstream. In this view, the puzzle is not so much demand, which is amply there, but a question of supply. And to put it more provocatively, the real research question should be, why are so few populist radical right parties in Europe successful, given a relatively fertile breeding ground? In my book, I suggest various supply-side explanations, including external supply, such as political opportunity structures, the media, and the behavior of mainstream parties. Most importantly, however, I believe that the true answer lies within the internal supply. That is, the populist radical right parties themselves, most notably in their leadership, their organization, and their propaganda. But to gain further insight into populist radical right parties, we have to move away from the ahistorical, economic, and sociological determinisms, tested by endless reanalysis of the same imperfect secondary data sets. Political scientists have to study the politics of politics. In this case, the actions and motivations of all relevant political parties, including the populist radical right ones. This will require innovative research designs and methods, including ethnographic research at the meso level, and might lead to alleged non-results. However, these will only be undertaken if the larger political science community gives them due credit. I admit, a distant dream rather than the present reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and in my recollection of Stein Rokkan and his style of work, this was really very much in line with it. First of all, the eclectic but imaginative use of statistics, and also based on the principle, the methodological principle, that there isn't any one method you should use, but you should always use the best available data that could answer a theoretical question. And the third is that you had a very powerful storyline, so there was no noise in the audience. Everybody was listening. And the fourth is that it really was revisionist, that is looking at the world in a different way. There is another word which also has and has look, which is respect. And I think the reason why you combined all these things, including the revisionist part, is also the reason why you gained the respect, which was embodied in the prize that you received. So thank you very much for that. And now you're going to Professor Gordon and his report. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's an inestimable privilege to be collecting the Stein Rokkan Prize in this, his hometown, from this, his university, from this, an institution, organization that he cherished. His presence hangs heavily over them all. You know, less a Viking raider, more a sort of Hansa trader, you know, doing deals and making links to and among everything he touched. I can't help thinking how much he would enjoy this first World Social Science Forum that you've organized. Doing my homework for this occasion, I found a volume memorializing the first quarter century of the ISSC, in which Stein Rokkan recounted how his initial enthusiasm for the project wavered with the realization, as he sadly said, that the great majority of social science is carried on by people who work just within their own strictly national or even local frameworks and only rarely try to compare their findings with those established for other countries. But, he continued, I did not give up hope. I became convinced that the best long-term strategy was to acquaint a broad phalanx of recruits with the problems and possibilities of comparative research, and to help them cut their teeth on concrete analyses by opening up access to archives of data from a range of different countries. Well, our discretionary time project was most definitely a beneficiary of those early efforts of the ISSC pioneers. We drew on the rich resources of two major international groups collecting and harmonizing data from many different countries. We could confidently compare the US and Australia with Germany and France, and all of them with Sweden and Finland, only because of the Herculean efforts over many years of two organizations, the Luxembourg Income Study and the Multinational Time Use Study, and, I should add, the national statistical offices which have collected all the primary data which those fellows all massaged and harmonized. The problem to which our book was addressed goes back in its way to the same early period around the ISSC's own founding. And of course, poverty measured purely in terms of money is enormously important. We should never forget that. But as early as 1954, the United Nations charged us to look beyond mere monetary measures of well-being and the early Nordic level of living surveys in which our esteemed chairman was deeply implicated, constituted valuable first steps toward that. Those early level of living surveys looked at many important non-monetary aspects of material and social advantage, ranging from health to recreation to political opportunities. But there was one even more fundamental measure of one more fundamental resource that those early studies left unexplored, and that's time and the inexorable demands on our time. So we're all used to seeing poverty measures calibrated in terms of money. In the period that we were studying in our book, monetary poverty rates were around 6% in Sweden and Finland, going up to 12 to 17% in Australia and the US, with Germany and France somewhere in between. But money's only half the story. How long you have to spend working in order to earn a poverty level income is another important part of it. So you might say that our project actually grew out of a joke during the Clinton administration in the US. Question, why are you complaining about the state of the economy? don't you know that President Clinton has created 6 million new jobs? Answer, yes, I have 3 of them. You know, not good, right? So as a first approximation, and I'll refine it shortly, let's think in terms of a time or a time or money poverty line. Someone can be said to be in time or money poverty either if they have less than a poverty level income or if they have to spend more than 40 hours a week to get it. 40 hours a week is internationally stipulated by a convention that's come into force as the maximum amount of time that you should have to work in paid labor, right? Now, calibrated in that way, the poverty rate actually doubles in all the countries we were looking at, and that's most dramatic, of course, in the liberal welfare regimes of the US and Australia, where poverty was highest to start with. In my own country of Australia, in the year we were looking at, the proportion of the working age population that was either time or money poor was over 50% of the population. That's huge. That's bad news. But is that quite the right way to look at it? Well, it sort of depends on why people were doing all those hours in paid labor. So, you know, if they were all academics who really enjoyed their jobs and were fascinated by them and were doing it just for fun, that's one thing. That'd be okay. If they were corporate lawyers or merchant bankers who were getting paid sinfully for all those extra hours they were working, you know, that's okay with me too. The thing that's not okay with me is if those guys and gals were actually having to work all those extra hours just to keep out of poverty. And that sort of thought is what motivated the key methodological refinement at the heart of our work on discretionary time. The basic thought is simple and has been foreshadowed by Klaus. The thought is just, look, there are certain things you have to do in life, and you have to do a certain amount of time in those things. One of them is spending enough time in paid labor to earn at least a poverty-level income. Another is spending enough time in the household, in unpaid labor, to keep the household ticking over, you know, cooking and cleaning and shopping and taking care of the kids, stuff like that. And a third is spending enough time in personal care to keep your body ticking over, so eating, sleeping, bathing, whatnot. The time that's left over after you've done the minimum necessary in all of those realms of activity is discretionary time, is time for you to use as you please. And that, as the subtitle of our book says, is a new measure of freedom. Or anyway, it's an important aspect of freedom. It's a measure of temporal autonomy. Now, of course, most people spend a lot longer than strictly necessary in each one of those realms. People usually want more than a poverty-level income and spend more time in paid labor in order to get more than a poverty-level income. But poverty is necessity. Earning more than that is strictly voluntary. It's a way of using your discretionary time, and a perfectly sensible way of using your discretionary time, I hasten to add. It's not a restriction on your discretionary time. And so too with unpaid household labor and personal care. You probably want a house that's cleaner than the socially minimally acceptable in your society, and you probably want more sleep than is physiologically necessary just to keep your body ticking over. But again, those are uses of discretionary time. They're not restrictions on discretionary time when you do more than is strictly necessary. Now, I bang on about that point just because it constitutes one of the key take-home policy lessons of our book. Time use researchers in those national statistical offices, you know, Stats Norway and such like, typically focus on how much time a person has left over after the amount of time that they actually spend in each one of those activities, actually spend in paid labor, actually spend cleaning the house, actually spend sleeping, right? And that's where, from time use researchers, you get these stories about the overworked American and how all the Americans are, you know, just working themselves to a bone. But on that measure, looking at amount of time they actually spend rather than the amount of time they need to spend in those activities, the case of the lone mother looks pretty indistinguishable from the case of a woman in a dual income, no kids family. I'll call her a dink. Look just about the same. But that changes dramatically if, as we suggest, those calculations are done not in terms of how much time you actually spend in those activities, but rather in terms of how much time you strictly need to spend in those activities. And looking at it in those terms, there's a huge difference between dinks and lone mothers. Even in Sweden, the best case, right? The other countries are worse. Even in Sweden, lone mothers have fully 20 hours a week less discretionary time than do dink women. That's like lone mothers having to do a half-time job a week extra over and above what the dink women do. That's huge. That's really important. Focusing, as the time use researchers and the policymakers and the national stats offices and people following them do, just on free time alone, conflates choice and necessity. It ignores a fact that should be absolutely central to social policy, which is that all those long hours that lone mothers are putting in, they by and large have to put in, whereas all those long hours the dual income no kid woman puts in, she by and large puts in out of choice. Now, of course, our book talks about lots of other household types other than lone mothers, but I focus on lone mothers because invariably they are the social group with the least amount of discretionary time and hence of particular social concern in consequence. And it's a concern for policymakers because the amount of discretionary time available to lone mothers varies dramatically across countries. In the US, it's about 20 hours a week, less than it is in Sweden, for example. So again, that's like a lone mother in the US having to work half a job extra over and above her counterpart in Sweden, or a full extra job over and above her dink counterpart within the US. Again, a big deal. The policymaker asks, so what are the sources of those cross-national differences? Are they just the sort of classic welfare state activities of taxes, transfer payments, child care subsidies, stuff like that? Well, that's part of the story, but somewhat surprisingly, the effect of those is pretty much the same across all countries, or anyway across all countries but one. Certainly it is true that different countries rely more heavily on some policy instruments than others, but summing the effects across all those three policy instruments, pretty much all the countries look the same. Pretty much all the countries give lone mothers about 5 hours more discretionary time than they would have had absent those classic welfare state policies. All but one, like I say. Germany's the exception. In Germany, whereas the other countries make lone mothers 5 hours a week better off in discretionary time terms, Germany makes them 5 hours worse off a week in discretionary time terms. They tax them just like everybody else, and they don't give them any benefits, and so they're 5 hours a week worse off. You don't want to be a lone mother in Germany, just in case any of you are planning this, right? Get out, go to Sweden, come to Norway. I mean, we just didn't have data about Norway. I'm terribly sorry about that. Another thing that differs between countries is divorce regimes. In our book, we consider three stylized ways a couple with kids might affect their divorce. First, the custodial parent might get no help whatsoever from the other partner. Second, the custodial parent might get help with the monetary costs of the kids, but that alone. And third, the custodial parent might get help with both the monetary costs of kids and also the care and labor associated with kids. Across most of the countries, each additional form of assistance that she got would be worth, again, about 5 hours more discretionary time to a lone mother. But in the US, the difference that it makes if the husband actually contributes to the financial care of kids is twice that. The reason it makes so much more difference in the US is simply that lone mothers in the US have much lower wage rates. In the US, the mean wage rate of lone mothers as a percentage of the national mean for all prime-aged workers is 66%. She earns, on average, 66% of the average prime worker. In Sweden, the average is 87%. So it's not just the classic welfare state tax transfer and childcare subsidies, it's also labor market policy, wage setting policy that helps make the big difference, that helps make lone mothers 20 hours a week better off in the US than Sweden in discretionary time terms. But in coming to a conclusion, let me just reiterate the prize committee's citation. It's in the form of a joke, but as always, the joke contains more than a kernel of truth. So the jocular lessons of the book are that if you want to maximize your discretionary time, partner up. That's worth about a dozen hours a week. Don't have kids. That's going to cost you a dozen hours a week. If you ignore that advice and you have kids, for God's sake, don't divorce. Or if you're going to divorce, whatever happens, make sure you don't get stuck with the kids. That's going to cost you another 24 hours a week. And finally, maybe consider moving to Sweden. That's going to buy you an extra 20 hours a week if you're a lone mother moving from the US. I can't help thinking that Stein would be amused. Tack för det.
Well, we are very happy that you both came to Norway rather than going to Sweden to receive the prize. Let me also tell you that some have certain fetish issues about numbers. You can, for example, have a preference for odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7. Stein Rokkan had a preference for the number 4, and I think he liked also to draw some key aspects of social organization along 2 axes, and he would end up with 4 corners, and much of his imagination was triggered by that, and that is why also in your case I sort of summarized what are the Rokkanesque or Rokkanian points. First of all, that you took a imaginative index, a statistical number, but then you turn that into a new conception, the second point, the restrictions on discretionary time, and then you translate the fate of individuals, which you organize and register by this number, into the fourth element, namely the political sociology and differences between regimes. Now, I think you both have basically earned your check. And you earn it by the fact that when we leave this room, we are changed. We think a little bit different about 2 very important phenomena as a consequence of the studies that you have carried out. I think this was fun. And I think one way we can use that fun is for those who want to line up for being part of the jury could pay to do so, and we will have the money for another prize. So in these ABBA times, I think I will say to you both, and also your co-authors, Robert, that thank you for the music. And now the rest is your discretionary time. Thank you for coming here.